Hey everybody, I hope you all had a great weekend and were able to enjoy a little bit, weren't overwhelmed with schoolwork or anything like that. So here we are in our second week on World War One and the Russian Revolution. We'll finish up talking about World War One today. I'll send you a couple other videos this week that deal with the Russian Revolution. And then on Thursday, we're going to have a quiz over World War One and the Russian Revolution. That'll be worth 50 points. We'll talk about that more in Zoom class this week. So anyway, so let's review for a second. So last week we kind of talked about most importantly kind of the build up to the war and the long-term causes being the alliance system, being nationalism, militarism, imperialism in all these European countries. Those were big issues. Um, the war itself kind of breaking out, and the immediate cause being the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then moving on from that, you've got the course of the war itself. Of course, the Schlieffen Plan, which was the German attack for the two-front war, but it was thwarted a little bit by the French, which caused this big long war of attrition or the stalemate where no side really gained any ground. And then, of course, the casualty numbers. The casualties in this war being so incredibly high and devastating that we're talking in the millions of people killed and how bad that is. We got also a little bit into the other kind of downside of the outcome of the conflict, how Germany was held so responsible. The 9 new nations that were developed: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, uh, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Finland. Okay, the Ottoman Empire being renamed Turkey and being kind of controlled by the British and the French. So lots of outcomes here as a result of the war. The war guilt clause, of course, on Germany being held kind of solely responsible for the war. So anyway, just shows you in 10 years how much the geography of Europe has changed, right? In 1914, it's only a handful of countries, and some are very powerful that, control large, vast areas. Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, people like that. 10 years later, you've seen we've got all these new countries have developed. Poland's a new country, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary are separated into two separate countries. You've got Yugoslavia here. The Ottoman Empire is now Turkey. Um, so lots of change in a relatively short period of time. So the map of Europe, remember to then see also Russia, it's Russia here. Here it is the Soviet Union or the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So we've seen a lot of change in a short amount of time. All right, so what are some of the other outcomes of the war here? One of the big ones, of course, is the formation of something called the League of Nations. You might know a little bit about the League of Nations. The League of Nations was kind of the forebearer to the United Nations, which exists today. The whole idea behind the League of Nations was to prevent another war like World War One from ever happening. Good job with all that. Anyway, and the League of Nations was the idea, actually, of President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who thought that this big peacekeeping body would be created and would be able to prevent wars from happening in the future because representatives from different countries can use diplomacy to figure out issues. Uh, Having one big League of Nations would prevent these alliances that exist that makes one country an enemy with another country and create all these other issues. The problem, interestingly, was the United States, and write this down, right? Make sure you understand this. The United States believed in the years leading up to the war in something called isolationism. And isolationism is a country's desire to remove itself from the affairs of the rest of the world. We still see that present a little bit today. You hear Donald Trump talk about America First policies. It's kind of a form of isolationism where you're not as involved globally. You're only more focused on your own country. So the League of Nations is this idea. that, of course, would significantly increase America's involvement with the rest of the world. Well, a lot of political leaders in America didn't want that. They believed their constituencies wanted us to be an isolationist country and not involve ourselves in the problems of the world. They looked at World War I in Europe and saw the devastation and say, why do we want to get mixed up with all these countries and get drawn into their wars and conflicts when we don't have to? So unlike other countries where what a leader says is what has to happen, it's a little bit different in the United States. And Woodrow Wilson wants the U.S. to join the League of Nations, but in order for it to happen, Congress has to support it. Congress has to vote yes. And Congress voted down the League of Nations, and the United States never joined. And this is really ironic because, of course, it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, and it was the United States that created the League of Nations. But, of course, the United States never joined. The League was semi-effective during the 1920s, but then in the 1930s, with the rise of Germany and Japan, it kind of fizzled fairly quickly, and then ultimately was replaced after World War II with the United Nations, which still exists today. Now, we mentioned this before. As a result of the war guilt clause, Germany was forced to pay $33 billion in war reparations. This, folks, is a lot of money, and it's an amount of money that Germany would never be able to pay back. $33 billion 100 years ago, which is about when this came in 1919, would be like, $20 trillion today, or some crazy, ungodly amount, as much as our national debt is today. So you're talking about a lot of money. In war reparations, you're talking about a lot of money that Germany's not going to be able to pay, because you got to consider the circumstances for Germany. They have to fix their own country after the war, which has been devastated by the fighting, and people dying and all that stuff, bombing and all that. And they also have to have the money to be able to pay back mostly France and England because of the war guilt clause and the money that they were made accountable for paying. So this was going to be really, really impossible for Germany to be able to do that. And ultimately in Germany is going to lead to them to have a very serious depression during the 1920s, which we'll get into next week when we start talking about World War II. Okay. All the countries in Europe have a depression in the 1920s because of all the devastation from the war. And you've got literally millions fewer people that are able to work, right? Because you got millions that died. You've got other people that were maimed or were incapacitated in some way, or have lung damage from gases, or lost an arm in the fighting, that now they're unable to work either. So all these countries in Europe are really strapped and have depressions in the 1920s. The worst depression in the 1920s was Germany, and theirs was way, way worse in the mid 1920s than the Great Depression was in the United States. So who are the primary figures with the conclusion of the war? These are mostly world leaders. Most notably, you have Kaiser Wilhelm II. He is the bad guy. He's the one that's held accountable, held responsible for basically what happened in the war. And of course, he's quickly removed from power. And Germany goes through a lot of different governments in the 1920s, most of which were ineffective. The French leader was Georges Clemenceau. He didn't really do much. He was French. The British Prime Minister at the time was a guy named David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was a very important figure, a very effective figure as Prime Minister of Britain. Next to Winston Churchill, he's probably their most successful Prime Minister of kind of modern times. So David Lloyd George was very successful. He's most noted that once the Treaty of Versailles was signed, they all went outside and everything, and there were people from the news or whatever, and there to ask questions about it. And Lloyd George was asked about the Treaty of Versailles, and he said, that the treaty is an armistice for 20 years. Now, if you don't know what an armistice is, it's basically an agreement to stop fighting. And he called it an armistice for 20 years. And unfortunately for him and the whole world, he was absolutely right. But it was kind of this famous foreboding that the agreement at the end of the war wasn't really going to do anything to really put an end to the conflict between these sides. There's still problems out there. And of course, the United States and the driver of much of the debate that happened in the Treaty of Versailles was Woodrow Wilson. Was a great foreign policy leader. He wrote something called the 14 Points that kind of outlined a lot of things, including the League of Nations, including the borders of the new countries that were going to be created as a result of the First World War. So Woodrow Wilson played a really, really pivotal role here. And this is probably the first time the United States really emerged as this big leader in terms of foreign policy. So there's a big moment for the United States. So now, Kaiser Wilhelm wasn't even invited to meet with the people at Versailles where they met. It's these three guys and the president of Italy, a guy named Vittorio Orlando, but he's not as important. But Kaiser Wilhelm, even though he's the guy that was going to get ganged up on and blamed, wasn't even invited to meet with them to have any say in what the terms would be in regards to the war. All right, so last thing I want to talk about today are some of the new technologies that emerged in World War I. We probably saw more new types of technologies emerge for the first time in World War I than in any other conflict in history. Okay. Now, one of the things that stands out in World War I was all the trench warfare. We saw trench warfare used for the first time significantly in World War I. There had been previous wars at times where there were trenches, but the trenches built in World War I were extremely elaborate and deep, and they would have like rooms in them and store places and offices and things that were just dug into the ground as both sides, as this war of attrition, the stalemate went on and on. These dug in ground trenches became, even more so these kind of outposts and headquarters militarily during the war, which led to all kinds of problems like diseases like trench foot. There were few places you could go and escape if there was a gas strike on your trenches, so that would be problematic. Gangrene and other diseases being down there because there would be rats and stuff like that. It's a pretty awful set of circumstances to be involved in this trench warfare, and we see it a great deal in the First World War. You see barbed wire. Barbed wire had been around for a while. Barbed wire was first created in the 1850s, popularized in the United States as a way to keep cattle from grazing in other people's land, because there's these pronged ends that can catch your clothes up or stick you in, and they're really messed up. Barbed wire became, this thing that would be used in the war effort, where you put barbed wire up at the edges of your trenches, and then that would prevent, your trench from being invaded. Another use for barbed wire really would be one, if you're crawling, crawling under and around barbed wire, you can, get kind of cut by it and pricked up by it because of the way it's made. But the other thing was more useful is you get your clothes kind of stuck on it and snagged, and you'd be stuck on the barbed wire. And while you're trying to free yourself, you become a much easier target for snipers and other soldiers. So it became an effective tool for easing the ability to kill people, which World War I was all about, killing people. Another big thing in World War I were new machine guns, automatic weapons that could fire, in some cases, up to 600 rounds of ammunition per minute are introduced for the first time. This is what makes the war so bad. So battlefield tactics had been for hundreds of years that on one side you've got some guys and on the other side you got the other guys. And, the one group side would fire and, all the people standing in line, some of them would get hit and they'd be out or whatever. And then you'd have to reload your weapon And while you're reloading, then the other side fires and it goes back and forth until one of the groups decides they've had enough and they run away or they retreat to another location. Well, with machine guns, you're taking away that need or that time to reload. So when you got two sides standing against each other and both sides have these massive machine guns, these Gatling guns that can fire 600 rounds a minute, you're just seeing people get mowed down. Okay? In other words, the battlefield tactics were so far behind the technology, and that was a big factor that caused so many folks to die in World War One. We see planes, we see automobiles, tanks, motorcycles are used for the first time for military purposes in World War One. We see automobiles used to transport, particularly usually generals or other important people around from place to place. They introduced the motorcycle in World War One as kind of an alternative to the horse. The horse had always been used in war for thousands of years. Now you have these motorcycles that can't be shot and killed. They can be an effective way to get around from one place to another. We see tanks used for the first time for military purposes. Tanks in the First World War were actually initially meant not to fire, not to have necessarily much firing capability, but they were meant more to, they'd be ways to kind of drive over and snuff out landmines. And also, you could use them to drive over barbed wire without having any damaging effect necessarily. But as time went on, we started putting mounted guns and things on tanks, and the birth of the modern tank was born there. Most notable in World War One were airplanes. The airplane had been around for about a decade. Now, the planes in World War One were these biplanes that were often open. The cockpit was open or open canopied planes, and the shooting that would happen oftentimes in these planes would sometimes be like a single. If it was a single seat biplane, the pilot would have like a handgun or whatever, and when they were up there, shooting at each other, the objective oftentimes would be not to really shoot their plane, but shoot the pilot and kill the pilot or something like that, and then the plane will crash. So that was certainly very commonplace during World War One. So it's kind of a different way with the targeting. Bombing raids were also done a little bit differently too, where the pilot would just carry the explosive or the grenades with them, and they just reach over the side of the canopy, the side of the cockpit, and just drop them on the enemy. So that was one way to do it. Okay, and so seeing using airplanes in the war. We get our first flying aces. People that shot down a lot of enemy fighters. The most notable from World War One is the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, who shot down over 80 enemy planes. The most notable American was a guy named Eddie Rickenbacker, who shot down about 30 enemies during the war. So we see airplanes used for the first time here again in the war effort. So this is another significant modernization. We see chemical warfare sadly being introduced for the first time, and obviously gas masks being something that were applicable as well. Chemical warfare is a horrible thing. It's using chemical gases to disorient and sometimes paralyze or even kill an enemy. There are things such as laughing gas and tear gas and things like that, or gases that cause people to itch, which would be disorienting to make them easier targets for, again, snipers, kind of like barbed wire was. But then there are more nasty chemical weapons like blister gas that was used that would cause your body or skin to blister all up, and that'd be real nasty. Mustard gas, which would kind of do some of the similar things. Mustard gas wouldn't kill you immediately, but it would be ingested and breathed in through your lungs, and this created a lot of lung diseases and problems for the soldiers that had dealt with it or ingested it during the war, and probably in many cases would cause them to die much sooner than they would have had they not been exposed to the mustard gas. The most horrible and lethal of all gases were nerve gas. And now this gas was used uh, very limited use, but basically, if you ingested or smelled or sniffed in like or gasped with nerve gas, you would have about 15 seconds to inject your body with a big syringe, something called atropine, which would cause your muscular system to shut down temporarily. So you go to a temporary paralysis, but that would kill the nerve gas from getting to your nerves and killing you, because if you didn't do that in about 10 to 15 seconds, you would be dead within a couple minutes. The chemical warfare was so awful that ultimately it was banned at the Geneva Convention in the 19. These type of things were banned in the 1940s and early 50s as about cruel and unusual punishment that's unacceptable, right? Uh, we also see grenades. Grenades had been around since before World War One, but grenades became really a common way to do more destruction more quickly during World War One. Grenades and landmines become a lot more commonplace during this conflict. One other thing that we see become commonplace in World War One was newer bayonets. They made bayonets that were more effective. One that they could cut through barbed wire, but another thing was if you're in hand-to-hand combat, they did the bayonets so if you're in hand-to-hand combat with somebody and you use the bayonet at the end of your rifle and you would stab somebody with it, you were told to twist it and pull it because there were grooves on the knife, on the bayonet, that if you twisted and pulled it in the right place, you'd be pulling somebody's organs out with your guts or whatever, and then that would ensure a more gruesome death. Flamethrowers were used by the Germans, just used to set people on fire. They didn't work out great because we quickly learned that if you shot somebody who had these big flamethrower packs on their back, that they would just blow up and the person would catch fire. So that kind of sucked for them. But yeah, all these technologies to show you how horrible and devastating the First World War really was. So we'll stop there for today. That's kind of it for World War One. Tomorrow I'll give you the first set of notes on the Russian Revolution. And yeah, folks, talk to you later.